Coming in for our 6th episode of Raybees Reviews, we'll be talking about First Berserker Khazan, a Souls-like from Nexon that took over the action gaming scene in March of 2025. FBK is one of those games that I feel like is honestly a bit underrated, despite how good its visuals and combat are. In a post-Elden Ring era where everyone and their mothers are trying to pump out Souls-likes, FBK, to its credit, definitely stands out from most of them. However, the more I played this game, the more I kinda realized why it hadn't reached some of the heights of other popular Souls-like Lies of P for instance. FBK in a weird way feels like a game lost in time. Everyone thinks it's great and holds it in high regard, but it hasn't impacted the culture in a way that you'd expect a game of this caliber to. So in this video, we're gonna delve into why exactly that's the case with our signature numerical breakdown of the game, and then post it up on our tier list here. Now, a quick disclaimer for you guys, specifically for this video. All my other general footage from playing the game was accidentally deleted.
You stupid.
So I'll be using Gamers Playground's full cinematic video to get some extra B-roll content. Full credit to that guy for making that video, and I'll link that video in the description below as well. Now, without further ado, let's start off with the plot. The starting premise for First Berserker Khazan is pretty good. Legendary general who saved the land from a world-ending dragon gets betrayed by the very people he risked his life to save. Brutally mutilated so he can never swing a weapon again, and gets hijacked by a mysterious thing that gives him supernatural powers that allow him to enact his revenge. It's a decently good premise and an extremely compelling start to your journey. While it is a bit vague and the voice acting does let it down somewhat, which we'll get into later, the start of the game is very good for introducing the players to the world and what's at stake, and even introduces a bit of mystery that becomes pivotal later on. However, even while the general storytelling is good, the plot unfortunately never really becomes truly compelling at any point during the playthrough. While you know that stakes exist and you're trying to figure out the mystery behind Khazan's betrayal, the plot beats kind of feel like flavor text to the action sequences, combined with some shitty pacing in the middle, and the plot of Khazan is just meandering at best and isn't really anything to write home about. Where it does deliver, however, are the endings. Much of the narrative breakthroughs come very late into the playthrough, and I'm talking closing cutscenes here. Depending on how much effort you put into the side quests and researching mysteries of both your betrayal and the larger chaos forces at work, you will get progressively satisfying endings that tie up the story in a nice, neat little bow. I like this kind of intelligent narrative agency design because the quality of ending you receive is directly tied to how much you're really willing to investigate the story's mystery. Unfortunately, while investigating, I found some massive plot holes regarding to the true ending and Rhys's death that doesn't really make any sense. For instance, all the tragic events of the story happened because one day the Emperor wanted to make Rhys one of his concubines. Honestly, I don't blame him. She refused and fled, which led to her capture and her execution, and that's the whole thing that started Ozma's tragic villain arc. So here's the question I have for y'all. Why didn't she just go to the heroes? Sure, the Emperor would have been jealous of them at this point, but this was before Ozma was tied down in chains, since that happened as a result of his retaliation to Rhys's death. And since Balerion revealed that Khazan's downfall was also orchestrated by Ozma, obviously after his villain arc, then both the heroes that killed the world-ending dragon were still in their prime when the situation between the Emperor and Rhys happened. So why didn't she just go to them? Why? When you actually sit down and think about it, the game just fundamentally never needed to happen in the first place if Rhys had just went to either Khazan or Ozma. But the game never fully explains why Rhys doesn't just use her common sense, or even how she was even captured in the first place, and it all leaves the door for this massive plot hole, which essentially invalidates the whole premise existing to begin with. So in totality guys, although I'll give it points for its compelling premise, relatively good storytelling, developing some sort of stakes with a nifty bit of narrative agency, the trash pacing and the massive plot hole that basically invalidates the whole ending all drag the score down, and I really can't justify giving it a score more than 5 out of 10. Moving on, let's talk about the character work in FBK. This is where things get interesting because unlike FBK's plot, the character work is pretty good. Both Khazan and Ozma are equally compelling characters in their own right. Both of them are wronged by the people they sacrifice everything to protect, and they respond very differently to the betrayal. Khazan reliably carries both the plot and the entire game off the back of his vengeance. Both his tragedy, anger, and eventual acceptance are the strongest and at times the only narrative anchor within the game, and serve as a powerful engine for bringing players along for the ride. Ozma's arc is arguably even more tragic than Khazan's, with him descending into madness and giving into the chaos corruption after his beloved was killed by the king. The two make for a great juxtaposition because while Khazan uses the chaos to fight back against the Emperor's betrayal, Ozma succumbs to the chaos and sinks deeper and deeper into ruin, turning his rage against the whole world and trying to destroy it as a result. Same pain, but different courses of action. Unfortunately, too much of these character arcs by virtue of the plot is largely concentrated in the final act, which makes the first 2/3 of the game narratively kinda boring. Also, aside from the big main characters, there's really no one else that goes through any sort of compelling arc either, which essentially makes FBK a two-man show. Most of them are simply like one-off characters that have like 5 minutes of screen time and meet some sort of tragic end sooner or later. The thing with overusing tragic ends is that it becomes very predictably boring after a while when you know like literally every single character that you meet is going to meet some kind of tragic end. It over-eggs the pudding and it just doesn't hit the same. So as a result, I'll be giving the character arcs a total score of 7 out of 10. The two leads are excellent and do most of the heavy lifting, but there isn't really much in terms of a supporting cast to make the plot beats quite as interesting. Lastly, we'll cover the voice acting to close out the narrative portion. Unfortunately, this is the first category where First Berserker Khazan falls to pieces. Remember when I said FBK is a two-man show? Yeah, it's most obvious in the voice acting. Outside of this righteous indignance conveyed by both the main leads, voice acting in this game is just fucking terrible. It comes off straight up goofy as fuck and is such an immersion break from the gritty, dark war fantasy theme that the game is trying to go for. Like, literally guys, if I closed my eyes and listened, I would have actually mistaken this game for some kind of like edgy Genshin Impact DLC. Actually, I think this is one of the reasons why no one holds the story in First Berserker Khazan on the same level as they do other aspects of the game. With shoddy voice acting like this, the game fails horribly at creating the bleak despair that's necessary for bringing this kind of story to life. I feel like FBK requires like grounded and mature performances to really sell the plot as having any sort of like discernible stakes, but I feel like the performances that were given here, it was more like what I expect from like a Broadway play, very theatrical and over the top instead of more cynical and real. I feel like Black Myth Wukong also has its problem where they have fantastic visuals and combat but virtually no narrative tension or compelling performances to make the game anything more than just a visually appealing combat experience. And given that the voice acting is a primary culprit here, I'll be giving it a 2 out of 10. If y'all have watched this far and enjoying the review style, consider this my time to beg for subs and likes. Just clicking 2 buttons gives a whole lot of motivation for pumping out these game reviews every single week, so I'd appreciate that from you guys. Now, back to it. Coming off this less than average narrative performance, we'll delve into FBK's sensory categories, starting with the visuals. And this is where the game gets its first big win. Safe to say guys, this game is simply gorgeous. The whole cel-shaded anime aesthetic that Nexon was going for was a very unique touch and gives FBK a distinct visual identity unlike virtually any other game in the genre. I've never really seen a game use this kind of art direction before, especially for a Dark Souls-like, and the game just pulls it off beautifully. The cutscenes, the cinematic framing, they're all just like truly fantastic, and it really takes some of the action sequences and boss fights to like the complete next level with crazy particle effects and animations. This is actually another comp that it has to Black Myth Wukong, and I swear to god guys, being compared to BMW for visuals is one of the best compliments I can give to like any game. The combat effects and dodge animations are the closest thing I've seen to that game's visual transcendence. Add to that the anime cel shader effects, and the boss fights can seriously start feeling like an anime battle. However, despite all of that being said, my biggest problem with FBK's visuals were the character designs, especially for Khazan himself. Now, call me old-fashioned or whatever, but I couldn't really fuck with how Khazan was designed. He looks a little bit too K-poppy in my opinion, and not like the legendary heart in general. Like, literally guys, like when I was playing, my sister came in to like look at the game as I was playing, and she couldn't believe like this guy was named Khazan, and this guy was like a general on like a revenge bender or whatever. He just like doesn't look the part. You know what I mean? Like he just doesn't, when you like play The Witcher, like Geralt looks the part. And I feel like Khazan really doesn't look the part, and it honestly creates a bit of visual dissonance because you're supposed to believe that this guy is on like an all-time revenge bend, killing everything in his path to get to the truth, but the motherfucker looks like a fucking Barbie doll. Another reason why I'll be taking off another point is because of the level design variety. It has this Lies of P problem where the game starts off looking uniquely compelling, but about halfway through the playthrough, I feel like the vast majority of these levels just start like blending in with each other. Considering the fact that the game progresses seamlessly from like a narrative or a power perspective, a lack of visual diversity can start to feel like you're playing the same map over and over again. And honestly, it just becomes a little bit boring. So overall, I'll be giving the visuals in First Berserker an 8 out of 10. It's still a gorgeous game by any stretch of the imagination, and honestly, huge props to Nexon for pulling off the whole cel-shaded aesthetics for Souls-like, because it really is a unique touch, guys. Next up, we'll move on to the music and audio, and this is another huge win for the game. The main theme, especially the ending credit song, Story's End, is so good that I instantly downloaded to my personal playlist the moment I finished the game. Along with Expedition 33's Lumiere, Feel from Lies of P, and like Silver for Monsters from Witcher 3, I think this has to be hands down one of the best songs to ever come out of a video game. I feel like just in general, all the songs and scores in this game really accentuate that reoccurring theme of tragedy, loss, and comeuppance. The plot might fumble the presentation a little bit, but the music really delivers on immersing the player into the pain of being like a righteous, noble hero, being so unfairly judged and the resulting indignation that can come out of that. The atmospheric scoring also does a good job of keeping in line with the dark fantasy ambience and provides that eerie sense of foreboding, especially when like exploring the chaos dungeons, because when it comes to the chaos, there's so much still left unexplained, and so that mysterious music track can like really immerse you, and you actually feel like Khazan exploring these mysterious forces at work. The combat and especially the boss fight scores were also done really fucking well and added to that visual spectacle. I feel like one thing I really like about FEK is the combat sounds, and especially the parry sound, which is so satisfying and creates that nice feedback loop that keeps you locked in. Aside from, I want to say, Ghost of Tsushima, I think this is the only other game that really does have good sound engineering when it comes to combat effects, and together with the crazy visuals, makes those big fights feel immersive and real. My only gripe with the audio, and unfortunately this goes in line with the problem that I had with the visuals, is that the scores can start blending in together a little bit. Maybe this problem stems from the lack of visual diversity because obviously the music follows suit and really creates this sort of like sensory repetitiveness throughout a lot of the levels around like the mid to late game. Like, I swear to God guys, around the late game I was so close to skipping through what would eventually become really important zones to achieve the real ending, simply because I felt like I was going to the same places that all had the same color palette and listening to the same tune over and over and over again. That really sort of becomes annoying around like the 25-30 hour mark in your playthrough, and so I had to dock a point there. But aside from that major gripe, the audio and sound absolutely slaps in FEK, and I'll be giving it a 9 out of 10. Coming off a near perfect sensory run, let's dive into the combat in First Berserker Khazan. Now, everyone knows the best thing about FEK is how good the combat feels. From how fluid the basic attacks are, to the flashy spells, to how sick boss attacks can look, everything looks and feels amazing. It plays like a hybrid between the slow, methodical combat of traditional Souls games, mixed in with the fast hack and slash of a more traditional RPG. It mixes both of these styles to create a super fun and welcoming combat flow for even like newer players to enjoy. And speaking of big boss attacks, I genuinely think the bosses in FPK can go toe to toe with the bosses from Elden Ring. I actually finished ER about like a month or so before I started FPK, and I thought I had seen all the genre had to offer in terms of like boss presentation and combat, and I was completely blown away the first time I fought Viper. I remember literally being like wide-eyed and frozen in my seat because I could not believe there was another game that existed that had like this level of boss presentation that could rival an Elden Ring. However, I have to be fair on both sides guys. The combat variety in FPK isn't exactly perfect. As much as I like the bosses, there is a decent chunk of boss recycling going on. I feel like even some of the big plot beats end with like a shit version of a boss that you fought a few chapters ago, which was like pretty annoying. I wasn't exactly happy with the mob variety either, and combined with the shitty narrative pacing in the middle, it can seriously be a drag to get through some of these chapters and make it to a unique boss without just like falling asleep. Another downside to mixing the trad Souls combat with the more streamlined hack and slash approach is that the game loses some of its combat depth and complexity. Sure, the game has a silky smooth feel to it and is very welcoming for newer Souls players, but I did find myself breezing through some of the big bosses. While they surpassed Elden Ring bosses for like presentation and visuals, the combat complexity didn't quite hit the same for all bosses. Outside of like pure mechanics checks and like the occasional use of like certain elemental consumables, it all felt like pretty straightforward for the most part. So overall, I'll be giving the combat in First Berserker Khazan a 7 out of 10. It's silky smooth and undeniably fun as hell, but it's a bit of a basic bitch when it comes to complexity, and the boss recycling definitely doesn't help. Alongside the combat, we'll also talk about some progression systems within First Berserker Khazan. Now, I found the progression itself to be largely hassle-free. You scale with levels and unlock attribute points to spec into, which is all the standard stuff. You can also find pieces of armor and weapons at an increasingly higher values that you can equip, or you can just like sell or dismantle them. I also like how there's 3 different types of weapons you can spec into, being the greatsword, dual wield, or spear. Each of them have their own unique reach and combat cadence and make for some real variety in how you approach the combat. I will say though, the weapon diversity is blunted somewhat by just how overpowered the spear is. Even though I dabbled in the other weapons, the spear's range and attack speed is just like, it makes it a no-brainer for clearing both the mobs and the bosses, and every time I tried to use another weapon, it was just like, overall just like less fun. But perhaps the biggest problem I have with an FPK is the bloated skill tree. So, I don't fully understand why this was the design, but the spells in FPK don't really have a cooldown to them. So you can basically just keep spamming your spells over and over again, provided you have enough spirit to use as a resource. Which then begs the question, why have so many spells when you can just get by with just spamming one? Now granted, I don't really think the spell tree is a problem here. I think the bigger problem is that the spells themselves don't have any cooldowns. It's such a weird design philosophy because it fundamentally destroys what could have been a fun spell rotation system with all the different spells that the game offers. because once you identify the most efficient spell, there's very little systematic pressure to have a well-rounded rotation. Just farm up spirit during combat and keep proccing the same spell over and over again. So this makes it pretty stupid to like equip and use other active spells, so I just ended up using the same spell throughout my entire playthrough, and I hate how I wasn't really incentivized to mix and match for different bosses. While this might be the most meta way to approach most of the fights, it certainly was the most boring. So aside from the spells having no cooldowns and just like the skill tree being kinda bloated as a result, and the lack of true parity between the weapons, everything else in Khazan is like pretty stock standard for the most part and done well. So 6 out of 10. Let's move on to the world design. Now, I generally think the world design in this game is very good. The levels are well laid out and they loop intelligently throughout your playthrough, and you can freely explore the different regions of the Pellos Empire in a way that feels intuitive but also expansive, which was a really nice flourish of maximizing the space for each level. You're generally rewarded very well for exploring with curiosity, either with gear, upgrade mats, collectibles, or some occasional lore. I think the lore drops you find in FBK are genuinely well thought out and add nicely to the immersion, but I honestly think the game could have used a little bit more of it. While the exploration was nice, it did end up feeling a little bit formulaic and repetitive without these interesting lore nuggets dropped more frequently. And this repetitiveness is also present in some of its side quests. The side quests operate in a little bit of the standard Souls formula. There's usually some kind of pressing concern that you have to take care of. However, there's no real build-up or urgency to these side quests, and they can start to become predictable after a while. To be honest guys, I also think the side quests kind of flop because the voice acting just isn't good enough to convey any sort of real stakes or seriousness, and the side quests can become a little bit of a goofy expedition with a recycled boss at the end of it, which is honestly a little bit of a letdown in my opinion. And that's honestly the problem with FBK in general. It looks and functions very well, but it all starts to get a bit repetitive both visually and gameplay wise after a while. I feel like the game systematically drops off a cliff around like the 25-hour mark, and it only picks up around the ending. At the end of the day guys, the world never truly feels alive, and it feels like it's mostly just a background so you can farm mobs and route to the boss, which feels like a bit of a missed opportunity because I really do think there's some serious material to work with here. So, while it does get points for the general world building and exploration, FBK fumbles the more immersive parts of the world design, so I'll be giving it a total of 6 out of 10. With all that being said, let's move on to more of the subjective takes, starting with quality of life. And as far as it's concerned, I think FBK is extremely seamless for the vast majority of its playthrough. It doesn't have that pedantic game pace that's basically synonymous with other Souls games, mostly because of its fast-paced combat. Aside from the midpoint of the story where I feel like the pacing of the game was a bit loose and started getting a bit boring and repetitive, the rest of the game is mostly fast and fluid. Like I talked about earlier, there are some level and boss recycling that make this game feel a bit unoriginal at times, but I think this is the vast minority of cases, all things considered. From the free respec to the generous offerings of armor and weapons to the upgrade system, there's virtually nothing that makes this game a chore to get through. There's no weird storytelling, no poorly designed bosses, or boring combat. I would go so far as to say if you're trying to get into Souls for the first time, I really can't think of a better game than First Berserker Khazan. 9 out of 10. To wrap up with enjoyability, I think 7 out of 10 is the perfect score for First Berserker Khazan. From everything to the visuals, to the music, to the amazingly fluid combat, First Berserker Khazan is genuinely a uniquely fun experience that I would wholeheartedly recommend to anyone who's starting out with Souls. While it does falter a bit narratively and basically doesn't even have a reason for existing, I think the overall sensory packaging of this game is simply phenomenal. If you're looking for your standard action RPG fix and probably the best beginner Souls-like on the market, I really do think FBK should be your first choice. It has top-of-the-line visuals, great auditory support, and extremely fun combat. And that alone justifies the price tag, especially if you're not too anal about narrative consistency or voice acting the way I am. Now, with all that being said guys, let's quickly add up the scores. Plot, 5 out of 10. Characters, 7 out of 10. Voice acting, 2 out of 10. Visuals, 8 out of 10. Music, 9 out of 10. Combat, 7 out of 10. Progression systems, 6 out of 10. World design, 6 out of 10. Quality of life, 9 out of 10. And overall enjoyability, 7 out of 10. Which brings us to our total score of 66, which puts it squarely in the good, maybe even great category within our tier list. Alright guys, that's it from me in this video. Thank you so much for watching. Like the video to boost this review to other people who will also enjoy this kind of review style, and subscribe so you can catch new episodes of Raybees Reviews in your feed sooner. I'll leave the entire playlist here on screen for you guys, so you can jump in on all the past episodes if you haven't watched them already. I'll see you there. Peace.